So I'm just going to provide a very, very brief overview of all the administrative items that you've heard today. So next slide, please. So just want to briefly highlight the services of each division that constitutes the administrative work of the city. So the city administrator's office oversees day-to-day operations of all city departments and ensures the goals and policy directives of the mayor and council are implemented. The Department of Race and Equity works with all city departments to implement a racial equity theory of change, with which Darlene so eloquently conveyed through her presentation, through an action process that includes increasing awareness about racial equity, how it operates, the harm it does, and mobilizing advocates, certainly within the city of Oakland, to support and act towards furthering a shared vision. And so they accomplish that through the Department of Race and Equity, through the race and equity teams, the trainings that are provided, community engagement, and much more. Next slide, please. The finance department safeguards the city's assets and shows that it serves the fiscal steward of the city. They accomplish this through a variety of means in terms of fiscal processes, including budgeting, accounting, procurement, payroll, financial reporting, and investments. And so the finance department gave a very comprehensive overview of not only their operations, but also some primers in terms of the budgeting process that the council will undertake very soon. And with that, we move on to the Department of Workplace and Employment Standards, who educates workers and employers on labor laws and enforces those laws, and they promote access and participation in quality jobs. They work to ensure equitable access to contracting opportunities by maximizing the participation of small and local businesses. And the next slide, please. Human resources attracts and works to retain a highly skilled workforce. Director Appleyard talked about the different units within the group that oversee areas ranging from employee relations, employee classifications, the Equal Access Program, which provides translation services and speaks to how the city is making its services accessible to people who may not have English as their first language, administers the Employee Benefits Program, and oversees the Risk Management Program, which was certainly critical, particularly during COVID-19. And lastly, we just heard a presentation from the Information Technology Department and about their strategic plan and also their role as a backbone in terms of designing, deploying, maintaining IT systems throughout the city. And so with that, that just concludes my brief summary of the administrative items that you heard today. And I don't know if there are any questions before we move on to the presentation for Oakland Animal Services.
Thank you. I'll just note for my colleagues in the public, there's also a briefing document that has been included with this and the other 3 sessions. And there's good information in that document that supplements the PowerPoints, including some budget information and performance objectives and successes. So please make sure you take a look at that as well if you want to learn more about some of the work we're doing in these departments. Okay, let's move on to the Oakland Animal Services.
Great. Good afternoon, Council President Bass and council members. I welcome the opportunity to be here today to talk a little bit about Oakland Animal Services. The services we provide, our overarching philosophy, and I'm going to especially focus on the types of services that your constituents may reach out to you about to help you better understand how we operate. Next slide, please. The mission of Oakland Animal Services is to improve the lives of people and animals in our community by assisting injured wildlife, facilitating adoption of shelter animals, supporting guardians of companion animals, combating animal cruelty and neglect, and when needed, serving as a safety net for the neediest animals living in the city of Oakland. Next slide. And of course, I'm talking about animal services, but I really want to keep you focused on the fact that we serve people and that most of the people we serve are low income. They're mostly Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And just looking at the service usage of OAS, comparing it to the 2018 Oakland Equity Indicators Report, looking at zip codes that are more than 60% BIPOC, That is 89% of the people who are unable to keep their pets and bring them to OAS, 90% of the people who are requesting veterinary services for their pets, 85% of the people who are looking for their lost animals, and 62% of our adopters. Next slide. And then focusing just on East Oakland, and just looking at zip codes 94603 and 94621, overall, 38% of the people who are surrendering animals, 37% of the people who are requesting services for their animals, 28% of the people who are looking for their lost pets, and 6% of the adopters. So I share that because I think it's important for us to keep in mind who it is that we serve. Next slide, please. One of the things we're really focusing on is creating a community-based model. And what I mean by that is shifting from how OAS has historically operated, which is really a shelter-based model, which is reactionary, which is really thinking of ourselves only as responsible for rehoming the animals that come into the shelter. And instead, we're really focusing on how do we support people, particularly people with limited resources, in having companionship of animals and in keeping their pets. So our focus is on increasing accessibility, addressing historic inequities and systemic racism, which is very deep in animal welfare, and when we can, providing access to veterinary care for people who cannot afford that. Next slide. So increasing accessibility, we're now open 7 days a week, 42 hours a week. We're open until 7 o'clock on Thursdays to make it easier for people with limited access to transportation to be able to get here. Our animal control officers are on regular shifts from 7 a.m. to 9:30 p.m. and are on standby for all other hours. One thing I do want to acknowledge is that we're very short-staffed with our public service representatives. So that's our front counter staff, people who are answering the phones and are going to be the people that most people are interacting with when they come into the shelter. And what that means is that we're not able to keep up with answering our phones in the way that I would like to. Oftentimes calls are going to voicemail. And with the budget crisis that the city is experiencing, we're not anticipating being able to correct that. So I feel badly about that. Next slide. I just also want to point out the intersection with human services and just giving some examples where this is relevant. Approximately 1 in 10 people experiencing homelessness are living with animals. As you know well, people who are unsheltered in Oakland are predominantly BIPOC. The lack of affordable pet-friendly housing is a significant barrier to exiting homelessness. It's a significant reason that a lot of people are homeless because they don't want to give up their pets when they're unable to find affordable housing. And that animal companionship is correlated with increased confidence and resiliency for people who have experienced trauma. And I share that to say that not everybody has animals or appreciates their relationship with animals, but what a huge role that animals play in people's lives and how much we want to be able to support people in having that companionship when they want it. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we've been focusing on for the last few years and making changes is really looking at how can we remove every barrier to adoption to make it easy for people to adopt, particularly for people with limited resources. So that's having low to no adoption fees, being as accessible as we can in terms of when we're open to the public, not requiring applications, and being as welcoming as we can. And we're really just focusing on matchmaking and trying to help people find the right pet for their circumstances. Next slide. I mentioned addressing inequities. One of the things we're really focusing on is, again, looking at the history of not just Oakland Animal Services, but animal welfare in general, and particularly animal control, is a long history of punishing people for being poor, for seizing animals when people can't afford veterinary care. And what we really are focusing on is differentiating between people who love their animals and need support and true cases of cruelty and neglect. So our officers are now empowered whenever they see the opportunity to help people and connect people with veterinary services. They always have in their trucks food and supplies and toys and other things to help whenever they can. Next slide. And so this is an area that you may receive requests for support. And so I want to walk through a little bit about how we operate and in a lot of ways how what we do can be misunderstood by the community. So one of the first things is that our animal control officers are well trained. They are required to follow the California Penal Code. They're largely looking at the state laws around animal welfare, which are very specific in what constitutes minimum care standards for animals. So it's not unusual for us to receive a call for somebody who thinks that maybe it's their neighbor's animal or an animal they've seen in their travels that they think is being neglected or experiencing cruelty. And it's important to understand that all we can do in those instances, or rather what the officers can do, is to look at the state law and see does the person meet the requirements and cannot impose their own personal standards on individuals. It's also important to understand that animals under state law are considered property. And as such, the owners of that property have considerable rights. And if we are in a position of violating those rights, by overstepping our authority, we will lose any leverage in those situations. So again, the officers are particularly careful about, ensuring that they have proper evidence, just like OPD, they're required to provide evidence to get search warrants to search properties and things like that. They really can't just go in and take animals as sometimes people would wish they would. Next slide, please. And just how we think about animal welfare checks. And this again, and I'll just be honest, I received quite a number of emails from community members who are frustrated by what they perceive as being a lack of follow through by our officers. I've also received emails from council offices and from the mayor's office that I would just say oftentimes the description of the conditions of the animals can be upsetting. And it's one thing that I ask is, to not accept everything at face value, because I have received messages that will, from a council member's office that will say, this is horrible. Please get those dogs out of there, or, please intervene in this way or the other. And that really sets the officers up with an expectation that if they don't do that, they're not doing their jobs. And it's not unusual for the officers to go in and do an investigation and not find the conditions as were described, or find that there's a guardian that absolutely adores their animals and really just needs and would welcome the help. And it's not unusual to find that we are drawn into conflicts between neighbors in areas where we have no authority to intervene and really have no reason to be involved. And so we're very careful in those situations not to overstep. And I think it's I think kind of the core is thinking about for the animal control officers themselves. Each one of them has, several active animal cruelty cases going at any given time. And the investigation of those cases requires them to see horrific things, to stay with those cases for a long time, to see them through. And, a lot of the evidence they see is truly haunting. And they're willing to show up for that and to do that work. And I again receive messages from people who say, your animal control officers aren't doing their jobs and they don't care. And what I want for people to understand more than anything is how deeply they care, and the constraints that they work with that for them can be challenging as well. So I'm just incredibly grateful for their service. Next slide. I mentioned access to veterinary care, and this is something that I think this is a crisis. This is a crisis even for people with means to get to a veterinarian. There's just an extreme shortage of veterinarians. This is local, statewide, national, and all indications are this is going to just get worse. There just simply aren't enough students coming out of veterinary schools. There are very few veterinary schools in the country. There are a lot of economic reasons why the market around veterinarians have shifted dramatically. And so, you know, again, for anybody with resources, it can be difficult to get a veterinary appointment when you need it, especially if you have an emergency. And for people with limited resources, it's nearly impossible to get veterinary care for animals. And that's a space that we're stepping into in honestly a very limited way. We don't have the resources to address this need in the way that we would like to. So we're really directing the resources we have to the people who need it most. We're focusing most of our resources on people who are experiencing homelessness. And we have, over the last couple of years, received grants so that we could provide veterinary care. We are doing it through monthly vet clinics. Those grant funds have been expended, and to keep things going, what we're doing now is mostly our animal control officers with the vet tech and other outreach staff are going about every 3 weeks to the community cabin sites, the safe RV sites, to different places, homeless encampments, and really just building relationships and just going around and seeing who needs help. So providing vaccinations, providing free food, and where there are medical needs, including spay neuter, bringing those animals to the shelter to provide those services. Next slide. Community cats is another area where you may be contacted. As you may be aware, there is a growing population of cats in Oakland, in the region, in the state. It's another situation that is, there's not an easy solution because, as I mentioned, the extreme shortage of veterinarians leads to an extreme shortage for access to spay neuter. And so what we see at the shelter level is a year-over-year increase in the number of cats that are coming into the shelter, the number of kittens that are being born, the number of people that are asking for our help to either get cats off their property, to get help to get them spayed and neutered, sometimes concerned about the well-being of the cats and want us to move the cats. And so one of the things that we just have to look at is triaging those situations and, you know, with our limited resources and trying to figure out what's the most meaningful thing we can do. So when it comes to relocation, we're really only focusing on truly urgent situations. It's very difficult to relocate cats. There just aren't enough places for them to go. So we're really just focusing on situations like a property that's being demolished and a habitat that's being destroyed, wanting people to understand that the very best thing we can do when we have the opportunity is to get those cats spayed and neutered to stop the growth of population. But it is a challenging and it can be a frustration for people that just want us to do more. And of course, we'd love to do more. Next slide. Assisting wildlife. This is another area where you may be asked for guidance, for help. It's a kind of a confusing situation in that there are multiple agencies that are involved with wildlife, and it can be confusing to figure out which is the right place to go. So just for clarification, OAS has pretty limited authority when it comes to wildlife. We may only intervene if wildlife are sick or injured, and we can, of course, remove deceased animals. But when it comes to conflict with wildlife, if people are just frustrated by noise or animals coming into their yard, wildlife are protected, and California Department of Fish and Wildlife have overview of that. So there's not anything we can do except for provide some resources and advice. And then Alameda County Vector Control oversees rodents, bats, insects. So not important for you necessarily to remember all of that, but to know that we can help navigate what is a very confusing area. Next slide. And then just to end, I've been the director now for almost 3 years. I'm excited to see that things have changed for the better in terms of life-saving for shelter animals. Our overall live release for all shelter animals is 92%, which is relatively high for a municipal shelter. We are in an open admission shelter, which means we're required to take in all the animals and we cannot turn people away. And often those animals are sick or injured or maybe have some behavioral issues. The live release rate for cats has been really high. Going back to 2014, we have a really great safety net for cats. And where I'm most excited is that our live release for dogs has increased considerably. It was just at 83% at the end of 2019. And as the end of December 2022, we're at 94.5%, which is, again, really, really great for a municipal shelter. And a lot of that has to do with introducing a lot of great programs like a foster program for big dogs and improving the adoption process, as I explained before. Next slide. And that's it for my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Director Dunn. Definitely appreciate your work. And I had a chance to visit the animal shelter before the pandemic with your volunteer coordinator and kind of see how things work. I know you also rely on the community to be successful.
Yes, in a huge way.
Yes. So let's see. Let's go to Councilmember Ramachandran.
Thank you. Thank you, Director Dunn. I have a pretty quick question. So you mentioned, and I've been involved in this a couple of situations, navigating whether to call OAX, vector control, et cetera. And I know that's kind of tricky. In my district, there are a lot of wild animals in the hills and other places. My question is, when it comes to deceased animals, whether the best way to report one on public property is 311 or directly calling your office?
Oh, directly calling our office. You can, there on our website, there's a form that somebody could fill out. And then also on the website is the phone number to call. We have one officer who's assigned to pick up deceased animals. And so that's the best way to do that.
Thank you.